Hello and welcome once again to this wonderful offering by neilib.com. We are dealing with the expansion of Stalinism as a part of our world history study, topic number 10, which deals with authoritarian states. And in that, we have completed quite a few topics which link with Stalin, his expansion as an important political leader, and the kind of methods that he used in order to achieve some of the more social and economic aims, such as collectivization, modernization, and industrialization. And the methods, of course, chiefly we have covered the method of terror, and through that we have looked at the questions and the case studies dealing with purges, the Great Terror, and so on and so forth. Now this chapter or this video onwards, or this exploration onwards, we are dealing with the question of Stalin's domestic policies and their impact between 1929 and 1953. What is the kind of role that these played? If you look at the years very carefully, 29 is the year when he becomes the absolute leader of the Soviet Union, and 53 is the year in which he dies. So this will deal with the entire period of his leadership when he is the only person in charge. How does the domestic issue, how does the society around him get changed? If you need any additional support apart from whatever is written here, there's another wonderful book by the same author whom I have mentioned in the last video a couple of times, someone called Orlando Figes. His work on the society and cultural life in the Soviet Union is called Natasha's Dance. So that's a more cultural history of the way Soviet Union survived and the cultural aspects of Soviet history under the rule of Joseph Stalin. So what about arts and medias? What kind of impact did Stalinism as a thought process, as an ideology? If there was so much of terror and fear, what was everyday life like for the people? What were they doing in terms of art, literature, religion, education, etc.? This is something that we are going to deal with in this exploration. So let's begin from arts and the media, and let's start with literature. In 1932, Stalin declared to a gathering of Soviet writers that they were engineers of the human soul. So literature work is very important, he says. Their task was essentially a social, not an artistic one. So they have to work for the society and not only think of creativity. They had to reshape the thinking and the behavior of the Soviet people. The goal of the artist, he said, had to be social realism. It is not surprising, therefore, that when the Soviet Union of Writers was formed in 1934, it declared that their first objective was to convince all members of the need to struggle for socialist realism in their works. This could be best achieved by conforming to the set guidelines. So whatever the state asks you to do, if you do that, you will achieve socialist realism. Writers were to make sure that their work, number one, was acceptable to the party and in its terms and in its themes and presentation. Number two, was written in a style immediately understandable to the workers who could read it. And number three, contained characters whom the readers could recognize as socialist role models or as examples of class enemies. So us versus them. Either they are people like us who are serving the revolution, or they are people like them who are the enemies of the revolution. What is socialist realism? It is a representational work which related directly to the lives of the people. So realism means the real life of the people and has to be related to socialist ideas and ideologies. Of course, the hypocrisy of all of this is that you cannot capture the real life of the people, because if you do that, will be completely against the party line. So you have to capture what the party says is the real life of the people. You don't have to really capture the real life of the people. These rules applied to creative writing in all its forms: novels, plays, poems, and film scripts. So everything had to be following this party line. It was not easy for genuine writers to continue working within these restrictions, but conformity was the price of acceptance of survival even. So if you wanted to survive, you had to conform. Otherwise, you would either be sent to a gulag or you would have to be exiled. Surveillance, scrutiny, and denunciations intensified throughout the 1930s. In such an intimidating atmosphere, suicides became very common. Historian Robert Service, whom we have already met, the writer of Stalin's biography, historian Robert Service notes in his biography of Stalin that more great intellectuals perished in the 1930s than in fact survived. So just like the people, the government, the military, even amongst the writers, most of them will perish and very few will survive. In 1934, Osip Mandelstam, a leading literary figure, recited a mocking poem about Stalin at a private gathering of writers, which contained the lines, "Around him fawning half men for him to play with, as he prates and points a finger." So as he prates, like as he rotates his hand in a certain way, as he dances in a certain way, and he points a finger, everybody else is like a half man, as a subhuman, is just fawning around, is just falling down to praise him, says this particular author. He was informed on and died 4 years later in a gulag. So immediately it was complained against him, and then he later on was given such a heavy sentence that he eventually died in a prison camp. He once remarked, "Only in Russia is poetry taken seriously, so seriously that men are killed for it. So that is the kind of, real capturing of this entire authoritarian movement. Stalin took a close personal interest in new artistic works. One word of criticism for him was enough to destroy a writer. The atmosphere of repression and the restrictions on genuine creativity had the effect of elevating conformist mediocrities to the position of influence and power. So if you were conforming, regardless of the talent you had, even if you were mediocre, you could have immense influence and power because you were supposed to be the party's correct representative in artistic spheres. This was a common characteristic of totalitarian regimes in the 20th century, that anybody at any level could be promoted regardless of talent as long as they were conforming. Pasternak and Sloshtistin. Amongst the most prominent of the writers persecuted under Stalin were Boris Pasternak and Alexander Sloshtin. Pasternak's work were regarded by the authorities as implicitly critical of the Soviet system and therefore unacceptable. His Dr. Zhivago, a novel that later became greatly admired in the West, was in fact refused publication in the USSR during his lifetime. Eventually, Pasternak went on to win the Nobel Prize for Literature as well. Slotin was a deeply spiritual man, was regarded by the authorities as a subversive person, and had to spend many years in the Gulag for falling foul of Stalin's censors. His documentary novels such as One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich and The Gulag Archipelago, which was published after Stalin's death, describe the horrific conditions of the labor camps. In fact, The Gulag Archipelago has just been republished by the Princeton University Press in wonderful volumes with beautiful introductions as well, and you might want to have a look at them if you are interested in exploring this side of the Russian history. What about theatre and film? The Union of Writers set the tone for all the other organizations of art. Filmmaking, opera, and ballet all had to respond to Stalinist demand for socialist realism. Abstract forms were frowned upon because they broke the rules that works should be immediately accessible to the public. So if people have to understand something, things cannot be abstract. They have to make sense in a certain context. An idea of the repression that operated can be gained from the following figures. In years 1936 to 37, 68 films out of 150 had to be withdrawn mid-production, and another 30 had to be taken out of circulation. So 68 plus 30, 98 out of 150. That's almost 2/3 of whatever cinema you were producing was either cut in the middle of the production or had to be pulled out of circulation. In the same period of 36 to 37, 10 out of 19 plays and ballets were ordered to be withdrawn. And in 1937-38, so that's a year after, theatre season, 60 plays were banned from performance and 10 theatres closed down in Moscow and another 10 in Leningrad. So amongst them, Svelod Meyerhold, a prominent victim was the director Svelod Meyerhold, whose concept of total theatre had had a major influence on European drama. Despite his wish to bring theatre closer to the people, his appeal for artistic liberty, the theatre is a living, creating thing, we must have freedom, yes freedom, that is his quote, led to a campaign being mounted against him by Stalin's sycophantic supporters. He was arrested in 1938 after a 2-year imprisonment during which he was regularly beaten until he fainted. He was shot. His name was on the list of 346 death sentences that Stalin died on one day of 16th of January 1940. So all this has been discovered in the archives, that Stalin had a little blue pencil with which he would just tick the number of names, that like the number of people who he wanted to get rid of. So in that sense, there's a very dystopian and disturbing meme about this as well, in which Stalin seems to be on the phone calling somebody, and like this person who he is in love with is telling him that, come home, my parents are not home, to which Stalin says, I know, because I was responsible for them being not at home. So that is the kind of attitude. He's killing people every day, he's murdering people every day. Numbers of thousands of people are dying every day because of the lists that he's signing. Even the internationally acclaimed director Sergei Eisenstein, whose films Battleship Potemkin and October, celebrating the revolutionary Russia proletariat, had done so much to advance the communist cause, was heavily censured. This was because a later work of his, Ivan the Terrible, was judged to be an unflattering portrait of a great Russian leader, and therefore by implication disrespectful of Stalin. What about painting and sculpture then? Painters and sculptors were left in no doubt as to what was required of them. Their duty was to conform to socialist realism in their style, and at the same time honor their great leader, was captured in an article in the art magazine Ikustvo, describing the prize painting of Stalin in 1948 as the image of Comrade Stalin is the symbol of the Soviet people's glory, calling for new heroic exploits for the benefit of the great motherland. So this is a poster and propaganda typical of the time, showing Stalin as the leader of the adoring people. Poster art was a very effective way for Stalinist authorities to spread their propaganda. So you can see how he is there in all of these paintings. Music. Since music is an essentially abstract art form, it was more difficult to make composed to respond to Stalin's notions of social realism. Nevertheless, it was the art form which most interested Stalin, who regarded himself as an expert in the field of music. So if Hitler was the artist, Stalin himself thought of himself as a good musician. And as far as Mao is concerned, he thought of himself as a good poet. So he used to write love poetry as well. So all of these great dictators, they seem to have some art form which really catches their attention. He claimed to be able to recognize socialist music, so he knew what was socialist music and to know what type of song would inspire the people. He tried to impose his judgment on the Soviet Union's leading composer, Dmitry Shostakovich, some of whose works were banned for being bourgeois and formalistic. However, the Great Fatherland War gave Shostakovich the opportunity to express his deep patriotism. His powerful orchestral works depicted in sound the courageous struggle and final victory of the Soviet people. At the end of the war, in return for being reinstated, he promised to bring his music closer to the folk art of the people. So he was ready to, in some senses, work with the state in order to work for the people of the Soviet Union. Amongst all of this, of course, or literature, art, cinema, music, all of that will, of course, be used in order to entrench further, in order to deepen further Stalin's cult of personality. That fact that he is the central figure of everything that is being done in the Soviet Union. One of the strongest charges made against Stalin after his death was that he had indulged in the cult of personality. He had certainly dominated every aspect of Soviet life, becoming not simply a leader but the very embodiment of the nation itself. So he is not a leader of the nation, he is the nation, was the kind of logic that was given. From the 1930s on, his picture appeared everywhere. Every newspaper, book, and film, no matter what its themes, carried a reference to Stalin's greatness. So even if you were writing a technical physics book, you had to give a reference somewhere in the beginning or somewhere later on to Stalin's greatness and how everything was becoming possible only because of his greatness. Biographies poured off the press, each one trying to outdo the other in its veneration, in its respect of the leader. Every achievement of the USSR was credited to Stalin. Such was his all-pervasive presence that Soviet communism became identified with him as a person. The cult of personality was not a spontaneous response of the people, it was imposed from above. The image of Stalin as a hero and the savior of the Soviet Union was in fact manufactured. It was a product of the Communist Party machine which controlled all the main forms of information such as newspapers, cinema, and radio. As Roy Medvedev, a Soviet historian who lived through Stalinism, later explained, everywhere he put up monuments to himself. Thousands upon thousands of factories and firms named after Stalin in many cities such as Stalinsk, Stalino, Stalingrad. So that's how the cities were also being called after him. More than one could count. When Stalin was encouraging the cult of his personality, he and his cohorts shamelessly falsified party history, twisting and suppressing many facts and producing a flood of books and articles and pamphlets that were filled with distortions. And these were then, of course, repeated, and that is why you could create all of this. George Orwell's very famous quote that if you control those who control the present control the past, and those who control the past can control the future. So if you have your hands on the present, you can control the past, which is through the creation of all of this, and then of course this helps you control the future as well. Amongst all of this, you have the Stakhanovite movement. A fascinating example of the distortion was the Stakhanovite movement. In August of 1935, it was claimed that Alexei Stakhanov had hewn 14 times his required quota of coal in one shift. So that was the claim. The story was wholly fabricated, but the authorities exploited it so effectively that Stakhanov's purported achievement became an inspiring example of what heights could be reached by selfless workers responding to the calls of their great leader Stalin. And there is a comparison of this in the fairy tale that George Orwell has written about this called Animal Farm as well, how one person can really embody all of this as the entire idea of Stakhanovite movement, or even the hard-working Soviet Union person who could do multiple times the work that could be done by a capitalist person. What about in print? Stalin's wisdom and brilliance was extolled daily in the official Soviet newspapers. Hardly an article appeared in any journal that did not include the obligatory reference to his greatness. Children learned from their earliest moments to venerate Stalin as the provider of all good things. And they could, in fact, children were encouraged to denounce that if their teachers or their own parents, if they had heard them speaking against Stalin, kids were encouraged to complain. Kids were encouraged to tell and speak against their own parents against their own parents about if they were doing anything against Stalin. There were no textbooks in any subject that did not laud the virtues of Stalin, the master builder of the Soviet nation and the inspiration of its people. Komsomol Komsomol is a youth movement, so it's the Soviet Communist Union for the youth. A particularly useful instrument for the spread of Stalinist propaganda was the Komsomol, a youth movement which had begun in Lenin's time but was now created as a formal body in 1926 directly under the control of the Communist Party of Soviet Union. Among the main features of it were the following. Number one, it was open to the children between ages of 14 to 28 with a young pioneer movement for those under 14. So you could be a part of this, but the name of the movement would be different. It pledged itself totally to Stalin and the party. In this regard, it was just like the German Hitler Youth that was also put into place by Hitler in Germany. Membership was not compulsory, but its attraction for young people was that it offered them a chance for eventual full membership of the Communist Party of Soviet Union. So from the age of 14, you could start aiming for full membership of the Communist Party, which would of course later on give you multiple perks and privileges. It grew from 2 million members in 1927 to 10 million in 1940. Komsomol members were among the most enthusiastic supporters of the 5-year plans, as they provided by going off in their thousands to help build the new industrial cities. It was Komsomol which provided the flag wavers and the cheerleaders and organized the huge gymnastic displays that were the centerpieces of the massive parades on May Day and on Stalin's birthday. Treatment of national minorities then. How were these other regions in the Soviet Union? By the way, the very people whom Lenin had promised complete independence as a part of his promise of land, how did they then were treated under Stalin? And do remember that Stalin himself is a part of one such national minority, the Georgians. Stalin by birth is not a Russian, he's a Georgian. So how did he treat the other national minorities? And you would of course remember that amongst the first few roles that he got in as early as 1917 was the Commissar of National Minorities. So the question of minorities is very close to his heart. Let's see how he deals with it. Although as a Georgian, Stalin belonged to one of the USSR's minority people, his concern was always about promoting the dominance of Russia within the Soviet state. So he was a complete supporter of Russification. He feared that to allow minority rights would encourage challenges to his central authority. So this would be against authoritatorship or central authoritatorship. Therefore, he feared against any kind of domination of minority rights or even acceptance of minority rights. One of his motives in implementing the purges was to suppress any signs of national independence by removing potential leaders of breakaway movements. A basic method he employed to suppress possible opposition was to deport whole peoples. Please understand, he was deporting entire peoples from their homeland to a distant region in the USSR. So Kazakhs could be just picked up and sent to Serbia, or Tajiks could be just picked up and sent to some other part of Russia. Similarly, some Russians could be Serbians could simply be picked up and put up in Kazakhstan. So whole people could be just collected and deported to another region so that they will find rootless existence in these places. A travelogue, in fact, it very beautifully captures the sentiment of these people who now find themselves in these new lands in the last 50, 70, 80 years, and how they are now surviving in those lands, by somebody called Erika Fatland, and her wonderful book called Sovietistan, which is a movement into all of these Central Asian republics which were once controlled by the Soviet Union, and how lives are there even today and now. And outstanding examples of this was that in 1940, the takeover of the Baltic states such as Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, and of Bukovina and Bessarabia resulted in 2 million people being deported, the majority of whom died in that process. In 1941, after the outbreak of war, Stalin, anxious to prevent the peoples of western region of the USSR from actively supporting the invading German armies, ordered the deportation to Serbia of various national groups including the Kalmyks, the Ukrainians, the Chechens, the Crimean Tatars, the Volga Germans. The deportations led to deaths of one third of them and of the 4 million that were involved. And by 1945, some 20 million Soviet people had been uprooted from their place of birth and homeland and deposited in some other region. So if all of this was the treatment of the minorities, which clearly are not getting any benefit out of him just because he himself is a part of that minority as a Georgian, what about religion then? What kind of things were dealt with in terms of religion? Religious persecution. Stalin shared Lenin's notion that religious faith had no place in a communist society. So just like Karl Marx himself said that religion is the opium of the people. So Marxism has no space for religion, and that is the same thing that both Lenin and Stalin share between each other. Religion with its otherworldly values was seen as an affront to the collective needs of the nation. In 1928, a campaign to close the churches was in fact begun. So they had to close the churches in 1928 itself. And the Russian Orthodox Christian Church was the main target, but all the religions and denominations were in fact at risk. So while one church was the main target of all of this, others were not free to propagate their own ideas. Even they continued to be at risk. Clerics who refused to cooperate were arrested. Thousands in Moscow and Leningrad were in fact sent to exile. So if you were a religious priest, etc., you were expected to cooperate, otherwise you would be simply sent to exile. The suppression of religion in the urban areas proved a fairly straightforward affair. It was a different story in the countryside, however. The destruction of the rural churches and the confiscation of relics and icons that most peasants had in their homes led to a revolt in many areas. The authorities had failed to understand that what to their secular mind were merely superstitious were to the peasants a precious part of their traditions. The result was widespread resistance across the rural provinces of the USSR. And the response of the authorities was to declare that those who opposed the restrictions on religion were really doing so in order to resist collectivization. So that's what I was saying earlier, that all this animosity is just in terms of dubbing people in a certain way. What is the reality of that entire name that is being given? That is irrelevant. So maybe somebody who was opposing the Soviet Union in the name of religion could simply be called a kulak, because the kulak as a term simply fits anybody who opposes the entire movement. So that really helps them. This allowed the requisition squads to brand the religious protectors as kulak and to seize their property. So that's the term of abuse. It can be applied to anybody who dares to revolt and question the system. Such was the bitterness these methods created that Stalin instructed his officials to call a halt. But this was only temporary. In the late 1930s, as part of the Great Terror, the assault on religion was also renewed. 800 higher clergy and 4,000 ordinary priests were imprisoned, and along the many thousands of ordinary worshippers. By 1940, only 500 churches were open for worship in the Soviet Union, which is 1% of the original figure in 1917. In 20 odd years, the 23 odd years, they completely reduced the number of churches by 99%. Obviously, this means that you can then worship somebody else who is occupying the position of God, which in this case is, of course, Joseph Stalin. Despite the Soviet denunciation of religious faith, the authorities were not above the using the residually powerful religious sense of the Soviet people to promote Stalin's image. Traditional worship, with its veneration of the saints, its icons, prayers, and incantations, translated easily into the new regime. Stalin became an icon now. It was literally true. His picture was carried on giant flags of the great organized processions, such as those held on May Day and his birthday. A French visitor present at one of these processions in Moscow's Red Square was staggered by the sight of a flypast of planes all training huge portraits of Stalin. "My God," he explained. "Exactly, monsieur," said his Russian guide. So he just said, "My God," and to which the Soviet guide said, "Yes, exactly, that is your God who is just flying across in the planes," which is, of course, Stalin's portraits. Impact of the war on religious persecution. The war against Germany, however, and its allies, which began in the Soviet Union for June 1941, brought a respite to the persecution of churches. That's a very interesting case study. While official policy was to denigrate religion, there were occasions when it proved highly useful to the authorities. Wartime provided such an occasion where religion could be used to bring together people and, of course, to provide them with some solace, because religion usually does that to people. It gives them this kind of, peace that other things may not be able to give them. And Stalin was shrewd enough to enlist religion then in fighting the Great Fatherland War. The churches were reopened, the clergy released, and the people encouraged to celebrating the upliftment Orthodox church ceremonies. For the period of the war, the Soviet authorities under Stalin played down politics and emphasized nationalism. Talk of the proletarian struggle gave way to an appeal to defend Holy Russia against the godless invaders. So the whole fight was then put in terms of holiness and godlessness. And of course, the enemy was always godless, whereas the Russians were always seen as this holy inheritors of this entire land. Russia is called, Moscow is called the third Rome. So after Rome itself and the downfall of Rome, the second Rome is, of course, Constantinople, and the third Rome is Moscow. So it has these religious ascriptions from a very long time. The church leaders responded as Stalin had intended. The clergy turned their services into patriotic gatherings, which expressed passionate defiance of the Germans. They urged their congregations to rally behind their great leader Stalin in the Supreme War effort. The reward for the church's cooperation was lifting of the anti-religious persecution. But of course, just like all other people who promised Stalin and believed any part of his promises, clearly immediately after the war, the repression shall continue. The improved church-state relations continued after the war to a certain extent. By the time of Stalin's death in 1953, 25,000 churches had reopened with a number of monasteries and seminaries. However, this did not represent any real freedom for the Orthodox Church. So all of this, as I said, is only to a limited extent. The price for being allowed to exist openly was its total subservience to the regime. So you could only appear freely only if you are completely ready to submit to the church. In 1946, Stalin required that all Christian denominations in the Soviet Union came under the authority of the Orthodox Church, which was then made responsible for ensuring that organized religion did not become a source for political opposition. The church became, in effect, an arm of the government as well. Just like many other organizations, the church also started doing the government's bidding in this time. What about education then? Stalin believed that the first step to modernizing the USSR was to spread literacy. To this end, formal education was made a priority. What does this mean? It means 10 years of compulsory schooling for students aged between 5 and 15. Core curriculum specified reading and writing, math, science, history, geography, Russian language, and Marxist theory. State prescribed textbooks had to be used. Homework was a regular requirement. State organized tests and examinations would be done. School uniforms would become compulsory. And fees was to be charged only for the last 3 years, which is 18 to 15, of non-compulsory secondary schooling. So through this development of an elite happened. The emphasis on regulation was not accidental. The intention was to create a disciplined generation of young people who would be ready to join the workforce, which was engaged through the first 5-year plan or through 5-year plans in constructing a new communist society. So these were people who were ready to be enlisted as the workforce for these new 5-year plans. The last feature regarding the payment of fees may appear to challenge the notion of an egalitarian education system. The official justification for it was that the Soviet Union needed a specially trained section of the community to serve the people in expert ways, such as doctors and scientists. Those who stayed on at school after the age of 15 were obviously young people of marked ability who would eventually enter university to become the specialists of the future. This was undeniably a selection process, but the argument was that this was on the selection based on ability and not class. This was the official line. However, although there was an undoubted rise in overall standards, the system also created an educated elite. Those who continued their education after the age of 15 were mainly the children of government officials and party members who could afford the fees. Private tuition and private education became normal for them. As a consequence, as university education expanded, it was party members of their children or their children who had first claim on the best places. As graduates, they then had the access to three key areas of Soviet administration: industry, civil services, and the armed services. Of course, that did not protect your life, as we have seen that that these were areas which were directly affected by the purges as well. So there was no kind of surety that you will have like life despite being like really high and despite being all of these things. But nevertheless, it did give you promise by and large of a better life than would have been if you were not fully educated. This leads to the rise of the Nomenklatura. Nomenklatura means simply the Soviet establishment, which are the privileged officials who ran the party and the government. The promotional process had an important political consequence. It enhanced Stalin's powers by creating a nomenklatura that had every motive for supporting him. The poet Osip Mandelstam described this precisely. He called them a thin layer of privileged people gradually came into being with packets. Those who had granted a share of the cake eagerly did everything asked of them. So packets, of course, are all these special privileges such as cars and villas. So while everybody else has to live in the same drab looking apartment, you could have extra privileges if you were a part of the party. The status of women then, how did Stalin change and how did Stalin continue thinking of women? Marriage, in keeping with their Marxist rejection of marriage as a bourgeois institution, Lenin's Bolsheviks had made divorce easier and had attempted to liberate women from the bondage of children and family. However, after only a brief period of experiment, Lenin's government had come to the question its earlier enthusiasm for sweeping change in the area. Stalin shared their doubts. Indeed, he was convinced that earlier Bolshevik social experiment had in fact failed. By the end of 1930s, the Soviet divorce rate was the highest in Europe, one divorce for every 2 marriages. This led him to embark on what was called the Great Retreat. So let's go back. Stalin began to stress the value of family as a stabilizing influence in society. He let it be known that he did not approve of sexual freedoms that had followed the 1917 revolution. He argued that a good communist was socially responsible one. A poor husband and a father, a poor wife and mother cannot be good citizens, he argued. Stalin, aware of the social upheavals of collectivization and industrialization were causing, was trying to create some form of balance by emphasizing the traditional values attaching to the role of women as homemakers and as child raisers. He also greatly emphasized the number of orphaned children living on the streets of the urban areas. Left to fend for themselves, the children had formed themselves into feral gangs of scavengers and violent thieves. Disorder of this kind further convinced Stalin of the need to re-establish the the family structure, which would in fact help to maintain the family as a unit of society. Changes in social policy. The first major move came in 1936 with a decree that reversed much of earlier Bolshevik social policy. Unregistered marriages were no longer recognized, divorce was made more difficult, right to abortion was severely restricted, family was declared to be the basis of Soviet society, and homosexuality was outlawed. All of this in June of 1936. Conscious of both the falling birth rate and of how many people were dying in the Great Fatherland War, the authorities introduced measures in July 1944 reaffirming the importance of family in the USSR and giving incentives, in fact, to women to have large number of children. Restrictions on divorce were further tightened, abortion was totally outlawed, mothers who with more than 2 children were declared as heroines of the Soviet Union. Heavier taxes were imposed on parents with fewer than 2 children, so you were expected to produce more than 2 children, and the right to inherit family property was then re-established. So, what about women and equality then? One group that certainly felt that they had lost out were the female members of the party and the intelligentsia, who had welcomed the Russian Revolution at the beginning as female liberation. However, the strictures on sexual freedom under Stalin and the emphasis on family and motherhood allowed little room for the notion of the independent female. Soviet propaganda spoke of the equality of women, but there was no great advance in terms of practical things. A housewives' movement was created in 1936 under Stalin's patronage. Composed largely of the wives of high-ranking industrialists and managers, it set itself the task of civilizing the tastes and improving the condition of the workers. However, the reality was that few resources were allocated and little attention was paid to the organizations such as this. Stalin spoke continuously of the nation being under siege and of the need to build a war economy. This made any movement not directly concerned with industrial production or defense seem largely irrelevant. Most women's organizations, even though they existed, fell in this category of being irrelevant. And finally, then the impact of war on the women's status. How did this in fact change? This war change on like what kind of impact did they have on the women's status? There were individual cases of women gaining in status and income in Stalin's time. However, these were a small minority and were invariably unmarried or childless women. Married women with children carried a double burden. The great demand for labor that accompanied Stalin's industrialization drive required that women join the workforce. They now had to fulfill two roles: as mothers raising the children, and then as workers contributing to the modernization of the Soviet Union. This imposed great strains upon them, markedly so during the war of 1941 to 45. The loss of men at the front and the desperate need to keep the armaments factories running meant that women became indispensable factory workers also now. In 1936, there had been 9 million women. By 1945, the number had risen to 15 million. Equally striking figures such as those in source R, which is on the page below, show that during the war, over 500,000 women fought in the Soviet armed forces as well. So not only are they joining the factories, they are also joining the armed forces. Half of all Soviet workers were in fact female by 1945. Without their effort, the USSR could not have survived, yet women received no comparable reward. Despite their contribution to the 5-year plans and to the war effort, women's pay rates in real terms in fact dropped between 1930 and 1945 despite their extra participation in the group. The clear conclusion is that for all Soviet talk of women's progress under Stalinism, the evidence suggests that they were increasingly exploited. It is hard to dispute the conclusion of the distinguished scholar Jeffrey Hosking that the fruits of female emancipation became building blocks of the Stalinist neo-patriarchal social system. So Stalinist system, which was a neo-patriarchal system, which represents patriarchy in another form, that really used the fruits of the women labor and of course gave them nothing in return. You can see the increase very clearly in terms of millions between 1928 and 1945, and you can utilize this chart as understanding in order to entrench your understanding for Stalin's domestic policies and their impact between 1929 and 1953. With that, we come to a conclusion of this topic and this particular video. In the next video, we will be looking at Stalin's impact on the foreign policy of the USSR and the kind of role that played into the making of Stalinism. I really hope to see you in that video. Till then, thank you so much.